On today's World Insight, a meeting of minds between the Chinese and Russian presidents. What's on the agenda in Wednesday's virtual meeting? Key takeaways on China-Russia relations. And HKSAR voters go to the polls this weekend for the first Legislative Council election since improvements to the electoral system. A Hong Kong insider with his thoughts on what's at stake in this election.
Well, I would say that this election is very important to Hong Kong in the sense that it will create a situation where we will have a more effective government as well as a more stable political situation.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. Chinese President Xi Jinping met with Russian President Vladimir Putin via video link on Wednesday, their first virtual meeting since June. President Xi said the all-around practical cooperation with Russia has produced political strength and unleashed big potential. He said China and Russia have acted as responsible major powers, becoming the central pillar of multilateralism. For his part, President Putin from Russian side said he looks forward to his upcoming visit to China, having accepted an invitation to the Beijing Winter Olympics opening ceremony. He said this year marks the 20th anniversary of the China-Russia Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation. The treaty has been extended another 5 years, allowing the neighbors to step up relations. So what more can we learn from the meeting? What can the world take away from this latest interaction between China and Russia? Let's ask our panelists. For more on the latest interaction between the leaders of China and Russia in Moscow, Professor Alexander Lukin, Director of the East Asian and SCO Studies from Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Long time no see, Professor Lukin. Good to see you again. In Shanghai, Zhao Long, professor from the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies with Shanghai Institute for International Studies. Last but not least, in Beijing, Cui Hongjian, director of the European Studies Department from China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to have the three of you on our program today. Professor Lukin, looking at the words coming from both sides, what's your assessment of the latest warming up stage, once again, of these two countries, the nature of it?
Well, we don't know much information because the meeting has just finished, actually. It was in the morning today, but from the open sources and from the official video, we can see that the discussion began from discussing the vaccines and the pandemic, which is an important topic, of course, because President Putin thanked President Xi Jinping for producing Russian vaccines, Sputnik and another one, in China. And this is, of course, a very important cooperation, taking in consideration that not everyone now cooperates on the pandemic in the world. But I don't think that this was the only one or even the most important topic. I'm quite sure that two presidents discussed economic cooperation, which is actually growing. The trade is growing this year, but also strategic cooperation, because the world is at a very dangerous, in a very dangerous period. We see this growing tensions in around Ukraine and Western pressure on Russia on that. We see that Western pressure on the Taiwan issue, and I know my Chinese colleagues and friends are very interested in how Russia is going to deal with the Ukrainian issue. I'm quite sure it was discussed, and kind of general Russian-Chinese cooperation vis-a-vis this Western containment policy.
According to some media reports, we do not have the confirmed transcript of the discussion yet. We wonder whether that will be made public, though. A new model of cooperation has been formed between our countries. That's being said by the leaders. Now, Mr. Zhao, what do you make of this new model of cooperation? What is that based upon?
Well, I think the reason that we can call it as the new model of a relationship is because after years of exploration, China and Russia have finally found the unique principles of interaction, which are non-alignment, non-confrontation, and non-targeting against third parties. So these can be seen as the solid foundation of our joint operations carried out to protect the security and also the pragmatic cooperation. And such coordination are not constrained, I would say, by some mandatory obligations of collective security, like in NATO form or other Western alliance systems. So it's not designed also for the purpose of provocation or deterrence. So I think both countries are benefit a lot from that kind of a new model.
However, both countries are having issues with the so-called Western countries. Professor Cui.
Yes, I think, of course, this time, for this meeting, the top priority is to strengthen the bilateral relations. But of course, if we look at the background of the tensions between Russia and the Western countries, and also the tension between China and the United States, so certainly there will be also very important agenda for the meeting to exchange, the views about the the relations with Western countries for both countries. As we know, especially recently, there has been the virtual meeting between Mr. Xi and Mr. Biden, and also there were also the meeting between Mr. Putin and Mr. Biden. So I think it's a very important time for President Xi and his colleagues in Russia to exchange what the views they touched when they are met with President Biden. But of course, I think that to show a solidarity in the frame of strategic coordination partnership, I think it's also very important, because I think China and Russia, they are not purchase a kind of a competition with Western countries. They just want to deliver a message that how could big countries to build up mutual trust relations.
Professor Lukin, how do you see the fact that as a result of their specific individual relationship with the West, the two countries are apparently becoming ever closer with one another?
Well, I think we should thank our American partners because they are pursuing a very strange policy of containing both Russia and China at the same time. And of course, this pushes the two countries together, because this is, of course, not the only reason, because Russia and China, in the first place, want to cooperate with each other both economically, like China is the first Russian trading partner since the year 2010. China also needs a lot of commodities from Russia, such as natural resources and some others. But of course, the international situation, and especially this kind of mindless American policy, pushes them quite quickly. So I think this is also a reason.
But Professor Lukin, if I could, there are a lot of interesting development regarding the relationship with the West. Recently, we also been hearing from media reports, at least, that Russia has been warning about implementing or installing, rather, intermediate missiles if Russia sees these threats as immediate and imminent. So how do you see that part of Russia's interaction with vis-a-vis the West? And how do you see China and Russia be able to see each other in the eyes in terms of protecting the fundamental interests, the core interests, in other words?
Well, but the West can only blame itself for this kind of tensions, because generally the United States for a long time now, about a decade, is pursuing a policy of kind of destruction of all the system of relationship and the agreements which it had with the Soviet Union and later Russia, including this intermediate ballistic missiles IBM treaty, which they withdrew themselves from. And now Russia, of course, can deploy, and which limited actually the number where you can, where countries could deploy this kind of weapons. Now Russia, of course, has free hands to produce it and to deploy whenever it wants to do, and of course it would be against the West, because we are friendly countries with China. It's not going to be aimed at China, for example, or any other country. So this is yes. Go ahead.
Thank you. So, Professor Cui, how do you see the different approaches that the two countries are having right now, apparently, toward the United States and toward the West? And how do you see at different development stages between the two countries, they are likely to have different approaches of approaching each other and also in dealing with others?
I think that for China and Russia, indeed, because they have a very different relations with Western countries, and so they do have a different approach to response any kind of a competition or even confrontations from West. Because also, comparing with China, it looks like Russia and the Western countries, they do have a lot of, military, confrontation, especially also, also because of geographic position. Russia is in Europe, so it's in the, part of the Western countries in geographic. But for China, I think mostly China has a very, very strong economic and trade relations with the West. So there will be some more long-term and comprehensive approach from West towards China. I think for China, the relations with the West will be more complicated than the relations between Russia and the West. So I think that maybe for China and Russia, there will be a common challenges from the change of international order, but certainly with a different response. I think that for both two countries, they can have a cooperation in a complementary way, not just do something in the same state.
Professor Zhao, agree?
Yeah, I think I agree with all of both mentioned, because we can see the importance of such a coordination. It's reflected by the timing also of this meeting. It was held right after the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting and also so-called Summit for Democracy, which highlighting the so-called Russia or China threats. So this meeting shows that I think that China and Russia share a similar position against a kind of ideological confrontation and such a narrative of democracy versus authoritarianism. So in terms of that, I think China and Russia are determined to be the stabilizing power in such an unstable global situation and safeguarding the international system with the UN as a core and also the international order based on international law.
Professor Looking?
Yes, China and Russia, yeah. Did you want to ask something? I wanted to say that China and Russia share basic ideas on the international order, which is based on the idea of a multipolar world. And also, I think in Chinese you have a very good expression, 和而不同, which means that there should be a harmony in the world, but we also should preserve differences and respect differences of each other. And this is a very different from the United States and the Western approach, which stand for kind of unity and the rules which they themselves put forward. And from that point of view, Russia and China are cooperating very closely, coordinate their positions in the United Nations organization, the Security Council, on many local, regional issues such as, say, Korean Peninsula or Iran or several others. So I can see a very good a future for the development of Russian-Chinese relations.
I see. Before we go, Mr. Zhao, I want to ask another small question and yet very significant question. The Winter Olympics is coming up. We know Russia is a strong player in Winter Games, and China is certainly participating since 1980. So how would you expect that the two nations are likely to show their strengths and also their enthusiasm about the winter sports?
I think on the Beijing Winter Olympics, the two leaders have shown the strong support to each other, and also for the athletes. So I think the winter sports is China as the newcomer to the winter sports compared with Russia. So I think there's a lot of space for the future cooperation. And indeed, we have also planning, as far as I know, the year of winter sports in the next 2 years for China-Russian cooperation. So that may be the new growth point for a kind of a pragmatic cooperation between our two countries.
I know a lot of the Chinese players were once trained in Russia, so were they in some of the other European countries as well. Thank you so much for the three of you joining us. Zhao Long, Cui Hongjian, last but not least, Alexander Lukin. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come. Hong Kong SAR voters go to the polls this weekend for the first Legislative Council election since improvements to the electoral system. A Hong Kong insider with his thoughts on what's at stake in this election. Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The Legislative Council, or LegCo, election of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region will be held this weekend. A total of 153 valid candidates have been nominated for the election, and nearly 4.5 million registered voters are expected to cast their ballots. This election is the first after the improvements of the electoral system in Hong Kong earlier this year. The improvement ensures the Hong Kong SAR is administered by patriots, enabling Hong Kong to properly carry out the principle of one country, two systems. Chief Executive of Hong Kong SAR, Carrie Lam, has encouraged Hong Kong residents to vote, saying the election is important. Earlier, I talked to Professor Lau Siu-kai, the Vice President of the Chinese Association of Hong Kong and Macau Studies. He's also the former Principal Advisor of the Central Policy Unit of Hong Kong SAR government. As a Hong Kong insider, here's his views about the upcoming election. For more discussion in Hong Kong, Professor Lau Siu-kai, Vice President of the Chinese Association of Hong Kong and Macau Studies, former Principal Advisor of the Central Policy Unit of the Hong Kong SAR government. Mr. Lau, with a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Legislative Council election, very crucial. Everybody looking at that election. How do you see it is coming?
Well, I would say that this election is very important to Hong Kong in the sense that it will create a situation where we will have a more effective government as well as a more stable political situation. And at the same time, I think the new electoral system and the new legislature will allow one country, two systems to be implemented in a more accurate and comprehensive manner. At the same time, national security can be protected because of this new electoral system and the new legislature.
There are a lot of praise for the possibility for stability as a result of the latest vetting process. But there were also some criticism suggesting the opposition voices might be silenced. What do you make of these mixed reviews, so to speak?
No, the opposition voice will not be silenced. Only those opposition who is unwilling to accept or recognize the new constitutional order of Hong Kong In fact, we have some candidates who come from the opposition background, but who are willing to declare loyalty to the country and to the basic law, to the constitution.
If you look at some of the coverage of the election in Hong Kong, particularly in the Western press, so to speak, you will see a very different version. How would you reconcile, your version of explaining about this election and also the version made in the stories of the Western press?
Well, the Western media and the Western politicians are hostile to both Hong Kong and China. In fact, they are the supporters of those opposition elements. They want to see Hong Kong adopting a Western model of democracy, which will allow anti-China, anti-communist elements to control the Hong Kong government and turn Hong Kong into a base of subversion against China. We are not talking about election for the sake of election or election to follow any Western models. We need to look at the matter from Hong Kong's perspective, from China's perspective, to see whether the election serves the purpose of making sure the one country, two system is successfully implemented and that Hong Kong's prosperity and stability are preserved. And the national security is also safeguarded.
So how are we going to make sure not only the one country concept is clearly understood and implemented, but also the continuity of the two systems within the principle of one country, two systems are also continuously implemented?
One country, two systems. We can name several, which are both more important. One is that Beijing will observe and respect the institutions and lifestyle of the Hong Kong people. The second, Hong Kong has the duty to protect national security. Thirdly, that the Hong Kong capitalist system will be preserved, and the Hong Kong's liberties and human rights are also to be preserved. But I don't see anything to affected by the Hong Kong national security law. At the same time, I think this law makes sure that Hong Kong can maintain stability and prosperity, but at the same time, allows Hong Kong to fulfill its duty under the one country, two systems to protect national security.
Okay.
I would say that in all countries and all places have national security laws. It's not surprised, we should not be surprised by the fact that Hong Kong also has national security laws. But this national security law is not supposed to threaten Hong Kong's people's liberties and freedoms and human rights in any aspect. It only affects those people who are determined or who have the ability to threaten national security.
We see a lot of new faces in the process of the Legislative Council election. How are we going to make sure there's going to be new blood coming into the body, certainly refreshing the future council, but at the same time, they are going to be capable and experienced personnel who know how to work for the people of Hong Kong and the interests of Hong Kong, of course, as part of China?
Well, I think that this time we have a lot of people who have no party affiliations, but who are really Hong Kong's social and economic elites who are willing to come forward to serve Hong Kong. And the new legislature, of course, will be populated mostly by these non-partisan professionals and administrators. But at the same time, it also means that the new legislature will be very much depoliticized, and political struggle, it has no place in the new legislature. I would say that many of the new legislators have a lot of public service experiences, and I don't think they have difficulty becoming successful legislators. And because of their professional expertise, they should be even more capable of overseeing and monitoring the activities of government to make sure that government can serve the people better. And I would also expect these new legislators, whether they come from geographical elections or other elections, I think both they themselves and Beijing expect them to connect the people more closely in the days ahead, so that the And in fact, the most Hong Kong people would like to see Hong Kong's social, economic, and livelihood issues addressed by the new legislature.
To you, what does this new election process that we have already witnessed some legislative council election is also going to be part of that. After the national security law being implemented, how do you see this new process now? What's going to be the significance of the success of every component of this process to make sure that the national security law is only helping Hong Kong to achieve the important goals for the people of Hong Kong and for the one country, two systems?
Hong Kong national security law will allow Hong Kong to return to a normal or healthy political situation. And on that basis, we can have other good things to come, such as prosperity, stability, and the national security.
Okay. Professor Lau Siu-kai, who is the former advisor for the Central Policy Unit of the Hong Kong HKSAR government on the latest election process of the Legislative Council in Hong Kong. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.